So today we're gonna talk about fiscal periods and dates inside of GP and how we set them up and why we would set them up. So as usual, I would like to thank my lovely both hosts actually are lovely, DexPro for giving me a platform to talk to my GP peeps. So Marlena, would you like to say anything?
So hi, thank you so much for joining. And again, we have a pleasure of working with the best trainer in the industry. So we are excited that you were able to join, and we here if you need any GP related support or system review or anything like this, we are more than happy to assist.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. A couple things to keep your eye out on things. So today is kind of like the third in a series, if you will, because we've already talked about doing a little bit of modeling with data from the general ledger. Today we did, this was the second. Today we're going to talk about dates, putting some dates into it. And then next month in June, we're going to create some general ledger visuals using the data that we've created. In July, the DexPro is offering another hands-on training course. It's an introduction, if you will, to Power BI, and we're going to be focusing on the GP accounts receivable data. So it's a 3 half-day courses. And then in August, we're going to be looking at sales order processing, particularly open documents and how we can manage them inside of Power BI. And as usual, I have a URL at the end and a QR code so that you can fill out a survey and tell me what it is you're interested in seeing, because that's what is driving the content that we have. So for today, our content, we're going to talk about a date calendar and why it's important, and talk a little bit about dates in general. Then we're going to create a date table in the query editor using the M language, using the table inside of GP. And then we'll also create a date table, so you can see two different ways of doing it using DAX. And we'll talk about what some of the pros and cons are. And if you have questions in the meantime, feel free to shoot them out. Haley, if you would just keep if someone doesn't come off mute and ask, if you'd keep an eye on the chat, and you could enter them in the chat as well. And just go ahead and interrupt me and ask me the questions as we go along. Then we're going to take and turn the table we create into an official date table, and we'll talk about what that is and why it's important as we go along. And then we're going to end creating some time intelligence fields, and we're going to use those in visuals. So time intelligence meaning year to date, month to date, quarter to date, same month last year, and so forth. So you'll get a little bit of a feel of how we can do that. So first, let's talk about dates in general. Now, there is a feature inside of Power BI that came out, oh gosh, I don't remember how many, maybe a year ago, maybe a little bit longer. I don't know, time goes by so fast, especially with the pandemic, that I've lost track of time. But you might notice that sometimes when you put a date in a visual, instead of it bringing over just the date, it actually brings over a hierarchy with the year, the quarter, the month, and the day. And this is some built-in auto time intelligence. Now, I know this is going to sound crazy, but my recommendation is you turn that off. And here's why. It's actually creating a lot of additional fields of information and columns of data based on every single date in your data set. So if you're working with something that has a lot of dates, particularly something like the sales order processing, where there's an order date and there's a quote date and there's the document date and there's the posting date, and all of those different dates, it's actually creating a lot of different entries, and it could slow down your refresh a lot, and it could slow down some of your processing. So my recommendation is that you turn off the auto feature of doing that, and then you create those hierarchies wherever you want them and wherever you need them. So they're not necessarily on every date, because in the case of sales order processing, you typically would only want it on the document date. So if you're looking at a quote, it would be the quote date, or if you're looking at an order, it's the order date instead of every single date. Because in the case of sales order processing, a lot of those dates are null. So you're creating all that extra workload on your report for nothing. Now to turn it off, you go to File in Power BI and then Options and Settings and Options. And then you'll notice where the 1 is, we have the data load. This is for the current file, although you could also turn it off under data load for the options, and then you would simply turn it off. Let me pull up my Power BI report here and I'll show you. I'm going to go to File, Options and Settings, Options. And when this pops up, this is where I went in and I turned it off here. Now, if you want to turn it off for everything you create from here on out, you would go to Global and turn it off here. And it's going to prompt you that you will need to get out and relog back into Power BI in order for it to take effect. But that's how you could turn it off. And it definitely will save you a great deal of time while you're refreshing your report. So that's one of the first things that I want to point out about dates. Now, when we're talking about dates, in the case of ERP systems like GP, dates are incredibly important to us because everything we do with data from GP is revolving around dates with very few exceptions. If you're looking at your inventory quantity as of right now, then that's an exception to the rule. Or if you're looking at your bank balance as of right now, that's an exception. But almost everything we do has a date intelligence or some kind of time intelligence need to it. And this would include, again, year to date, same period last year, and so forth. And to utilize the features inside of Power BI, particularly DAX, that enable us to create fields with this information, we have to have an official date table that has one row for every date of the calendar that you're looking at. And right now, let's just assume that we're talking about you or your customers being on a calendar year with your periods being individual calendar months. So let's just make that an assumption for right now, and then we'll move beyond that and later through this hour. Now, when we do that, basically we're creating a calendar. So we have one row for every day of the year, no more than that. So there's no duplicates. It has to have it in there. And this is how it's going to know to do a calendar. Now, you do not want to rely on the dates in your data set to do that, because there's a good chance that you might not have any transactions on January 1st because it's a holiday, or December 31st, or whenever Yom Kippur happens to fall, whatever holiday you or your company observes. You might not have any transactions that date. And if you're missing a date, you're not going to be able to correctly calculate the year to date or the same month over last year. It's just not going to work. And that's just the way DAX works. So we have to make sure we have dates set up properly in order to do this. Now, there's also another reason why we would want to have a date table. And this has to do with space. So we can make our data set a lot smaller this way. So you'll notice this is just a screenshot from Excel. We're looking at if we look at 1 year of data and we have 1 million records, let's say we're looking at the general ledger transactions, we have 1 million rows and it represents only 1 year. Well, on line number 4, if we were to add into our transaction query or table, whatever you want to call it, a year column, a quarter column, and a month column, so we could use those, we're actually adding in 3 million fields of data. That's a lot. Where if we add a date table, we would need to have the date so that we could create a relationship with the transaction table. And then we add the year, the quarter, and the month. Well, 1 year, we're only adding less than 1,500. So that's a big discrepancy between the two. And the more data you have, the more transactions you have, the bigger this difference becomes. So you can have a much smaller data set and it'll become easier to manage. And also, the mere fact that it's a separate table create something that the Q&A feature, the question and answer feature, calls interesting. So it'll become more, dates will become more interesting. So they'll play more of an effect in Q&A and in artificial intelligence visuals inside of Power BI. Okay, so once we create this date table, regardless of which way we do it, either through GP or through DAX, so we're going to do both here in just a few moments, we can create and should create relationships with our data. So in the sample that I'm looking at, I have in the top left, I have my account file or query where I'm looking at all of my general ledger chart of accounts. In the bottom right, these are my general ledger transactions with actual numbers in them. And then I also have my budget information populated so I can compare to the two. Those two are actually considered my fact tables or my transaction tables. Accounts is my dimension or lookup table. That's how I would look up this information. And then I have my fiscal periods, which is my date table. And this is also considered a dimension. And you notice I have relationships set up accordingly. And that way it knows how and which one to use. Now, let's go ahead before we spend time looking at this slide. Let's go ahead and connect to our data, to our fiscal period setup data inside of GP. So here I am in Power BI, and I'm going to click on the transform data to open up the query editor. You could actually start from get data, doesn't really matter, but I'm going to go ahead and just connect this way and then click on new source. And I should get my option for get data. So I'm going to go into my GP database. And once I do this, it's going to prompt me for my SQL Server and my database itself. Now, two things I want to point out. One, it's bypassing my credentials because it remembers my credentials from when I've used it before. So it's using those same credentials, and those credentials are stored in the desktop. So that's one thing to note. The other thing that I want to note is that the fiscal period table does not automatically grant access to anybody. So if you want to access it, you're going to need to go in and grant access to it, or preferably create a view, even if the view just gets everything from that particular table. Create a view for it. You'd be much better off if you create a view. And the table that we're looking at is, here we go, this is it, is SY 40100. Now, what this table shows is all the fiscal periods that are set up, and you could see the description. It keeps track of all these individual line items by their period and whether or not they're closed out and what they apply to. The other table that is related to this is the header table, and it only shows us what's at the top of the fiscal period. When does the fiscal year start? When does the fiscal year end? What's the fiscal year number or name, in this case 2020, and the number of periods in it and whether or not it's closed. That's all that stores. The other three, they typically don't really load much. I'm not even, honestly, I can't even remember what they're for. So we want to focus on this first one, this top one. This is the detail. So I'm going to go ahead and just select this. And again, you might want to create a view to get it. And then you could even do some of the cleanup ahead of time that we're going to do. All right, so here is my table. And if I look down at the bottom, there, oh, I was there, I guess. Okay. I have 17 columns in here, and I have more than 1,000 records, and I definitely do not need that many transactions or that many records. The reason we're seeing it is because let me scroll over. Let's look at period 1 here. For period 1 for this year, it's listing all of those individual things that you could close out, right? And all those different transactions, if you do go in and you do, I think it's mass close, you'll see all these individual things. So we definitely need to clean this up. But let's start by doing what I call Belinda's 3 rules. The first one is we're going to change the fiscal name to something that makes sense to our end users. So actually, let's call this fiscal periods. All right, so that's the first thing. We name the query as something that makes sense. so that in Power BI, when we're building reports, we have these names instead of SY40100. All right, this will make a lot more sense to our end users. The second thing I want to do is remove unnecessary columns. So what I'm going to do is click on this icon for choose columns on the home menu, and I could pick and choose what I want to keep. Now I want to keep the period ID, that would be the period number, whoops, did that backwards. Period ID, period, the start date of the period name. This will actually get the name if you change the name in GP in the fiscal period setup from period 12 to December, it'll display December here. So if someone's on a fiscal year, this is something that can be really helpful. And then I'm going to come down and get the year number and the end date. So these are the only 5 fields that I want. So now I have my 5 fields that I want. The second, or that was the second thing, remove unnecessary columns. The third thing is I verify the data type. So period ID, this is not decimal, it's actually a whole number. My dates, I want those to be in just a date, not a date time. And the reason for that, this is something important to understand. Now you could see in GP, we know we're used to the fact that we have the dates coming across with the time on them, and they always come across at midnight. And there's a few places where it does track the time, like a purchase order approval. It does track the time that that was approved, but it stores it in a separate field. You're going to be better off in your GP data if you keep the time number values in a separate column than the date values. And then you could use the dates for relationships. When I'm creating a date field, 12/31/18 at midnight is not going to equal 12/31/18 at 1 a.m. They're not going to be the same. So if we take it down so everything is just strictly a date and we have the time in a separate field, then we'll be able to match things up properly. All right, we have the fiscal period name, the year, that's another whole number. So let me set that. And then we want to set this to just a date as well. Okay, so those are the 3 rules that I always talk about. Belinda's 3 rules: rename the query to something that makes sense, get rid of excess columns, and make sure that the type is correct. Now let's do a little bit of cleanup. First of all, I don't want to display period 0 because period 0 is actually going to display the last date of the previous year as the start and the end date. And that's just going to confuse it because I want 12/31/2018 to belong to the year 2018, not to the year, or I guess in that case, it looks like it's a little bit off, but not to 2020, right? So I'm going to come in and just do a filter and get rid of period 0 and click OK. And actually, I'm going to just go ahead and call this period ID, just rename it. Okay. Now I have my period start date and my period name. So I'm going to highlight the period name here, and I'm going to rename this to fiscal period. And I'm going to trim it. If I click on it and bring my mouse down at the bottom, let me zoom in, you could see my cursor is not blinking directly after the 1, right? So that means there's excess space there. And that happens a lot of times when you're hitting a table directly. If a field can hold 17 characters and you're only using, what is this, 6, 7, 8, then it's going to leave 9 blank spaces at the end. So we want to trim off the excess space. This is going to serve a lot of purposes. One, if we concatenate or use it in anything, it won't have all that extra blank space at the end, but it also works at making our data set smaller. So I'm going to highlight this, and you would go to transform, and then you'd come to format and trim. I often right mouse click and choose transform and trim, but same effect. Then we have our fiscal year. So I'm going to call this fiscal year. And actually, let me change this to fiscal period. And then, oh, okay, we'll leave it period number. Okay. Actually, let's call it, well, we'll leave it period ID. Okay. Now that we have all that done, Now we have a lot of duplication going on here. So we want to get rid of the duplication. So what I'm going to do is up here in the top left corner, we have this table icon. And if I click on that, it's no longer selecting a particular column. And now if I come down and tell it to remove duplicates, it'll remove duplicates for the whole table. So now if I come to the bottom, you'll notice I only have 108 rows instead of over 1,000. So I only have one row of data for each fiscal period for each fiscal year. And I'm going to now just come in and resort this by the period date, which is ascending, which is the start date of a fiscal period. So you can see that being displayed. All right, so now I have my 12 periods for my each year displayed. Now comes the tricky part. If I want to turn this into something that has one row for every date, I have to do a function that will display this way. Oh, actually, before I do that, let me go ahead and put quarters in, because I could look at the fiscal period here. Doesn't matter if I have a January through December year or a July through June year. I could look at the period number and get the quarter. So what I'm going to do is come up to add column at the very top, do a conditional column, and I could easily put in my fiscal quarter by actually, you know what, let's just call that fiscal quarter. And I could come in and say, if the period ID is less than or equal to 3, then this will be Q1. And if the period ID, if it's not less than or equal to 3, is it less than or equal to 6? And if so, that's Q2. And the order is important, obviously, because if I did less than or equal to 6, then it's going to include the first 3 periods. So the order is important. And then I will do period ID again is less than or equal to 9 for Q3. And if it's greater than 9, it must be Q4. And I'll click OK. So now I have my fiscal quarter, and let me set the type to text. So I have my quarter down. I like putting the Q in front of it. I think it makes much more sense for a lot of users, as opposed to just putting in a quarter number. You could do the same if you track things by half year. You could create a conditional statement. If it's less than or equal to 6, it's H1, otherwise it's H2. All right, so now let's explode these. So for every one of these rows, I can create, I can have another row displaying all the dates in between these two. Well, to do that, I need to know how many dates are in each period. So I need to figure out the difference between these two dates. Now, if I come up and under add column and choose custom column, and I'm going to call this days in period. And what I'm going to do is simply just take my end date and subtract, I'm just double clicking on it, my start date. And you could see I have now this number here, and it's got like 4 different numbers. So I'm going to, this is duration. So it's actually showing me days, hours, minutes, seconds. Let's change it to a whole number and it'll just show me days. Well, this formula works well. The problem is it is showing me the difference between these two dates, and I need to know the how many days there are, including the last one. So January would be 31 days. So I need to take this formula and I need to add to it. So I'm going to come back and click on the gear for that custom formula, and I can now add to it. And I can't just go in and add 1, because adding 1, that would assume it's already a number. Now, one of the things I could do is, now that it's in this mode, I could highlight the whole column, go to transform, go to standard, and add 1 this way. I certainly could do that. And now that would be set. That's an easy enough thing to do. But I'm going to come in and change the M function. This is the M function. So I want to get the period date, the end date minus the start date. And then I actually want to subtract 1 from the start date so that it'll be calculate properly. So what I'm going to do, actually, let me just get rid of that end date. It might make it easier to see. And I'll zoom in. Okay, so I have my period end date that I selected and I have the minus. But what I want to do is now use the function add days. Let me go to date, add days. And I want to now come in and say, I want the start date, comma, and I want to subtract 1. So I'll do a -1. So now I have two different formulas together. One is saying get the period start date and subtract 1 from it. And then I want to take whatever that date is and subtract it from the end date. So now when I do that, and I come back down to the bottom, you notice now January has 31 days in it. So I have this period set properly. Now what I want to do is be able to explode. I know how many days there are. I no longer need the end date, so I could right mouse click and remove that column. So now I just need the start date and the number of days to be able to create a list of the rows that I want to populate. So again, this is another add column and a custom column. And here I'm going to actually call this date because that's what I want the column to be called. And what I'm going to do is come in and start typing in, let me try it the other way, date. Doing it backwards. And case is important. List dot, let me find it. There it is, list dates. Okay, list dot dates. And then once I put the start parenthesis in, I get my IntelliSense then. So what's the start date? So there's my start date. So I'll double click, put in a comma, and now count as a number. So I want the days in the period, comma, and now I need to tell it what duration I want it to be. And I only want it to increment by 1 day. So that way I'm seeing every day. So this is the trickier part. And this is why typically I don't write a lot in M. So to get the duration, it'll be pound. Don't worry, I have it in the handout. Pound duration, and then in parentheses, 1 day, 0 hours, 0 minute, 0 seconds, end parentheses, and one more end parentheses. And I hope I have that right. We'll find out in just a moment. And I'm going to click OK. Looks like I do. So now I have this new column that says list. And what I'll do, I have also on this list this is an expand button, a little double-headed arrow, and I'm going to click on this and I'm going to expand it to new rows. And then watch what happens. Now I have a row for every date. And when I get to the next month, period 2, so it just basically duplicated those first few columns and it's created a date for me. Now I need to set that date type properly. So I'm going to go ahead and set that as a date. But now I have a date for every one of my columns. And now I could get rid of the period start date. And I could also get rid of the days in the period if I am so inclined. I could leave that up to you, but I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of mine. And okay, so this is now my date. And now I could do some additional things. If I want to get the month name, if I'm on a calendar month, I could do that easily. Under add columns, there's date there. I could come in and get the name of the month. And this is helpful even if, regardless whether or not I'm January 1st through June 30 or January 1st through December 31st. I could also come in and tell it I want to get the day of the week if I want to, and so forth. I'm only going to get the month out there right now, but you could see I can add to it nice and easily using this particular fashion. So now that I have that done, I'm going to just click on home and close and apply. All right, now let's go back to the slide deck for a moment. So here are the two functions that I put in. And one of them is the days in the period. So you can see I have that whole function listed here. And then I have blowing up the days or expanding the days to create a function for each one. And now what we're going to do is create a DAX one, because I want you to see how this one works. And we're going to be I'm going to copy all of this, but we'll come back in. We're going to start it out manually, and then I'll cut and paste it. So what the DAX formula will do for us is we have the calendar here, that everything to the left of the equals is the name of the table or measure or column in DAX, whatever you're creating, in this case, table. And then I'm telling it, I'm going to create a table with multiple columns. So I'm going to add the following columns. The first one is going to be a calendar column based on date. This particular function will look at all dates in my data model, all the dates. And that's how it's going to calculate which dates need to have a calendar for them. So I've told it 12 that my fiscal year ends in December. That's what the 12 represents. And as a result, what I have here is it's going to go and look at my budget date, my transaction date, and my the actual date posted, the originating posting date. So for my work transactions, my unposted transactions, there is no originating posting date. So as we know in GP, when the date is null in SQL, it comes across as 1/1900. You've seen that in Smart List. And so those dates will come over as 1/1900. Then I'm creating some functions very similar to Excel functions. I'm getting a year, extracting the year from the date, and the year will be the column name, the month number, date, month, weekday. Okay, we're going to go through these and build these out. So let's go through and add in a date table. And I'm going to come in here into my data mode to do this. And you would not normally add a DAX date table and use your GP fiscal period. It would make no sense to do that. I just want to show both options here. I'm going to click on New Table. Once I come into this data mode, it opens up Table Tools, and I'll click on New Table. And here's my new table. Right now it's empty. So again, everything to the left is the name of the table. So I'm going to call this calendar. That'll be the name of my table. Everything to the right is the function. So I'm going to start with that calendar auto. Now there are two calendar options. One, I have to tell it the start date and the end date. So that would take managing. And the other one is this calendar auto. So I'm going to go ahead and select that, put in the last fiscal month, which in this case happens to be 12. That's enclosed in parentheses. And I'm going to click on it. And you're going to see now I have my dates. And it comes across as date time. Now I have those null fields. I told you about the work fields. So look what happened. It started my date at 1900. That means I have a row for every date starting January 1st, 1900, all the way through December 31st, 2028. That is just way too much. So let's go back to home, go to transform. Let's fix that date. So I'm going to come into my transactions, and you can see right here, these are the culprits. These are the things that are causing us the problems. And the easiest way to fix it is to do a find and replace. So if you highlight it, you could right mouse click and do it, or go to transform, replace values. And because this is a date field, I have to do things based off of a date. And the replace also has to be a date. Or it could be the word null. So I could replace the date with actually the word null. And now when I click on home and close and apply and come back in, give it a second to finish applying the transactions, and you're going to notice that the 1900 is going to disappear. So now it's starting with 2020, because that is the first transaction it could find occurred in the calendar year 2020. Okay, let's come back up. And let me do a little add column here. So I'm going to add a column, and then I'm going to just do a shift return so it's on both lines. So IntelliSense is telling me I need the name of the table, right? Well, this is going to be what table I'm going to get this from. If you're creating something with DAX, you're creating it, a table with DAX, you're creating it on data that's already in your system. So it might be like a summarized file, like give me the summary of all of my items sold. If I, in this case, the date, create a date table around the dates I already have in place. And that's what I'm doing here. So I'll find my calendar auto again, put in my fiscal month 12, and then IntelliSense has a comma after the table that I'm pulling this from. And now I'm going to do a shift return. And now what's the first column? So this is how I was creating it. In double quotes, the column name will be called year, and then comma, and then what's the function to get the year? In this case, I'll type in year. And once I type in date, I could literally see a date column. This is my date column right here. And even when you're creating it, you'll be able to see it. Unlike how I did here, where I created it and then went in and edited it. And then you could keep working your way down. I'm going to just put an ending here so you can get a feel. And now you can see this is how you could add multiple columns. You could also save your code and pull it in. So this is the same code that I have in my deck. You saw I copied it over. I'm extracting the year, so you can see how the year works. I'm getting the month number, and you might be going, why? We'll get into that in a moment. I'm getting the day, so this would be 1, 2, 3, and so forth. I'm getting the name of the month, and just like in Excel, Excel uses text, but if you want to get the month name, you would use format instead of text. And then in double quotes, you tell it how you want the format to be displayed. So to get the full month, I use all 4 capital M's. I'm going to get the name of the weekday, and then I'm going to get the weekday number. This 1 means that it starts with a Sunday. So if I were to click right there and get rid of it, you could see 1 starts with Sunday, 2 is Monday through Sunday, and 3 is Monday through Sunday, but Monday starts with a 0 instead of a 1. So depending on functions you're creating, that's why that option is there. And then finally on the quarter, I'm going to put the Q in front of the quarter like I did before. So I'm extracting out the quarter number and I'm concatenating it. That's what the ampersand means, with the Q in front of it. So when I click on commit, now I have all of my data structure right here. Now, just like before, if we want to use this date to create a relationship with, we need to make sure it matches. So you'll notice that in the column tools, or in the formatting pane as well, we have the ability to change the data type. And it's mostly for things you create in DAX. So I'm going to make that be date only, and then I'm going to change the format to be something that's a little easier for users to see. Another thing I'm going to do, since I told you I would talk about why the months later. If you've ever used months in a column, they don't necessarily line up. I can control the sort. So I'm going to highlight the month name, and actually, if I sort this whole thing, this table, you can see it does start with January. So I'm going to highlight the month column. And then now under column tools, I have a sort by column option, and I could sort by the month number. So now, if I use these as columns, and I'll be doing that in just a few, I'm not going to be sorting alphabetically. I'll be sorting chronologically based off the month number. And you could also do the same with the period. Now I'm going to highlight this whole column, right mouse click, and I'm going to tell it to hide the month number in report view. That's why it's dimmed out. I'm going to do the same with weekday and weekday number. I'll sort that by weekday number. And now I can hide the weekday number. Okay, the last thing I'm going to do is set this as my official date table. So I'm going to highlight, well, it doesn't matter where I highlight. I'm going to come up to table tools, and here is a mark as date table. Now I could have also come in and on my calendar one, right mouse click, and I have the ability to mark as date table. So when you mark it as a date table, you're telling it which column is your official date column. Now, again, it can only be displayed, each date can only be displayed on one row, and there has to be a date for everything. It goes through a validation process, and I'll click OK. I'm going to come in and quickly grant, somewhere over here is my fiscal periods, and I'm just going to hide this table. so we don't get confused. I wanted just to show you both ways. For GP customers, it might be better off getting it from the fiscal periods, then you don't have to worry about anything. But in going to now create a quick relationship, budget to budget date, or date to budget date, date to transaction date, boom, done. Now let's go back to the slides for a moment. And there's the screenshot for the replace values. This is where I marked the date table. And this is what marking the date table does. So again, it verifies that every date is a unique value, meaning it's not duplicated. There are no null values, they're contiguous, and that the field or the column itself is set to either a date or date time as the data type. I prefer time or date only. It'll be a lot easier for you. This will automatically, if you set something as official date table, it will automatically turn off the date hierarchies like I showed you at the beginning going into options. So I wanted to point that out. And this is something you want to do first because it could break some DAX expressions. You might have to go in and edit them if you do any date expressions first. Okay. And let's see, that's the sort by option. And that is like the second to the last slide. So let's use what we have just done. So here I have actual numbers. I have my account number here, and I have the actual numbers represented right here. What I'm going to do is just duplicate this page, and then I'm going to change this visual from a table to a matrix. So far it looks the same, but what I'm going to do is open up my calendar column, and I'm going to put my month in the columns. And you're going to notice that now when I've done this, you could see this is sorting in chronological order instead of alphabetically or by the value. Now I'm going to take this slicer and I'm going to make this year instead of account number. And whoop, let's try it again. Deleted the wrong one. There we go. So now I have my year. If I go into 2027, I could see certain pieces of holes. So this is one reason why we would definitely want to use dates and columns, because now we could use filters on those and it'll definitely make a lot more sense. But let's start making this a little, my dog is probably getting ready to bark because Amazon just arrived, but let's continue on with this journey. So what I'm going to do is come in, I'm going to grab just this first account number here, and I'm going to, let's do a filter count number. We'll put that in filters on this page, and I'm just going to filter that first one. Okay, cool. So we have the filter on that here. Now what I'm going to do is on this matrix visual, I'm going to get rid of account numbers and put my month down the bottom. And one of the things that you're going to actually, let me put years across the columns. Okay, oh, let me clear that filter. Okay, you're going to notice that I'm missing a lot of months. This is Fabricam data. And so there's a lot of months that don't have any data in it. And if there's a month, and there are quite a few months that don't have any data for any of the years displayed, they're just flat out not showing up at all. So what we want to do is be able to account for some of these transactions. So we're going to utilize something at first called quick measures, which is a way to make it work for you, or to show you some time intelligence much more quickly. And it's a good way to learn as well. And the quick measures work out really well if you are on a fiscal period and not if your fiscal periods are full months, because you could use that calendar like I showed you, and you could tell it what your last month of the year is. But if you or your customer has like a 4-4-5 period or 13 4-week periods, you have to then create these time intelligence pieces manually. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to collapse everything up on the right just to make it a little easier. Then over here on transactions, I'm going to click on that ellipsis and grab new quick measure. And you could also get to new quick measure from the top. And when I click on it, I have some time intelligence features here and some total options. We're going to start by looking at year-to-date total, but you'll also notice there's quarter-to-date and month-to-date as well. So we'll start with year-to-date, and it asks us what's the base, and I'm going to open up transactions, and I want to populate it with actual numbers, right? This is actually the net of debit and credit. And then for the date, I'm going to come in and grab my date field. Now you notice it has a little bit of a different icon now because that is my official date. And so I'm going to click OK. And it's going to automatically add in, let me highlight this. It's going to automatically add in this particular DAX function. And you could look, I could zoom in and look at it, but basically it's a total year to date using the field actual, and it's based off of the calendar date. And over here, the name is actual year to date. So if I were to bring this in and drop it in the values with my actual, what you're going to see is now for every year, I could see actual numbers and I could see the year to date. And you could see it is increasing wherever there's a dollar value, wherever the month has a dollar value. So now I have this year to date number listed here. And so this is one of the things I could do because I have done some time intelligence. Let's say that we want to get, let's see. So let's say we want to get a running total because we're looking at a bank account, and the bank account balance will roll forward, and we might be excluding balances brought forward. I don't know, we're going to pretend we are. So I could come in once again, and now that I have my one of the transactions highlighted over here under table tools, I could choose quick measure right here. So these are wizard driven measures. You could also see there's a year over year change, quarter over quarter change, month over month, rolling average, and so forth. I'm going to come in and grab running total. And once again, the base, I'll open up transactions. I'll put in my actual for the base. And for the, let's see. Did I get the wrong one? Oh, that's the date I want for the base. The date. And no, which one? Let me try again. I made myself nuts. Okay, come in. I think I used the wrong one. Because that wasn't what I was expecting. Where is, let's try it again. Oh shoot, I just hid the whole. Let me unhide that. Okay, let's try it one more time. Unhide in report mode. There we go. Okay. Let's try this one more time. New quick measure. There we go. Okay. So I wanted running total. Is it the, yeah. Okay. And yeah. Okay. So I'm going to get my account number and put that in the base field. And let me get the date there. Click OK. I'm going to do it ascending. And now I have an actual running total. Let me get rid of year to date. And so now I could see a running total using the date field. So it definitely is increasing. So I get to the end of the first year, it's 270,075 minus this 1900. So you could see it definitely is working according as we expect it to. I'm going to close that out. And now let's look at creating some of these manually. So again, I'm going to come up and I'm going to highlight transactions because that's where I want the measure to go. I'm going to add in a new measure and I'm going to create one for the previous period. So for the previous period, we'll come in and we'll say previous period, or actually let's do last month actual. We'll call it LY actual. And for this one, what we're going to do, this is a calculate function, and a calculate will allow me to override certain filters. So the expression that I want to get is actually the actual amount. I've already created a measure for that. So it's going to sum up my actuals, comma, and then now I tell it what the filter is. And the filter that I want to use is the previous month filter. So I'm overriding the filter for the line item and say, get it from the previous period based off of that calendar date, my fiscal date. And let me close that out. And in this particular case, let me come in here and I'm going to get rid of the year and let me bring it in here. Let me quickly also come into the calendar and add one more column in here. So I'm going to come in and add one called period. We'll just call it period. And this will be a format. Get from the date. That is going to be the year dash and a 2-digit month ending parentheses. Okay. And that should, oh, one more. No, that's right. Should get it done. And when that comes up, we're going to put the period into the rows and get rid of the months. And so now we have all of our periods, and we can see the actual and we could see the last month actual. So you could see the numbers are indeed showing me exactly what last month had in it. So let's also look at the same period last year, and we could do the same here as well. So I'll click on new measure again, and then we'll call this, we'll just call this last year actual. And once again, this is calculate because we want to override the filter. By overriding the filter, I mean right now the row filter is to look at January for 2024. Well, let me do February 2024. Instead of getting the actual number for February 2024, which is the filter, I'm overriding it and say, get it from the previous month. And so it's like, oh, this is February, must want January. And so it's getting it that way. So that's what I mean by overriding the filter. So this one will do same period last year, and we'll get the date from the calendar and finish encapsulating that. And then we'll bring in last year actual. So now here we have January. And if I actually come to January 2025, here's my number for January 2024, 241, and it also matches. And so you can see there's a lot of different things that we can do inside of using dates in Power BI by particularly creating DAX measures. But getting that date table is a key importance. So you want to make sure you have that set right. Here are the DAX measures. And if there are any questions, I'll take the questions. Meanwhile, this is the link to the guide. Are there any questions? Is anybody's head about to explode?
That happened about 10 minutes ago.
Okay. Yeah, it's a lot there, but dates, everything that we do when we're dealing with GP data, almost everything is date specific. So the key thing to remember is you want to get your calendar straight. And if you want to use any of those date hierarchies, do them with a calendar. I mean, because you could even create your own hierarchy if you want to. Let me go in and create a date hierarchy. So let's say that's what we want to use. So I'm going to zoom in over here. Okay, we'll go to the dates. So I have my dates over here. What I could do is on year, for example, I could click on this ellipsis and tell it I want to create a hierarchy. And it's going to create a hierarchy called a year hierarchy. And I could double click on this and rename this to date hierarchy. And I probably should not have if I misspelled it, and I did, don't laugh at me. All right, let's see if I could correct. Okay, let's just pretend that that's right. How about that? All right, let's just, you know what, we'll call it date group. Okay, so this is my date hierarchy. And automatically year is put in here. So if I want to include the quarter as well, I can click on the ellipsis for the quarter and I could tell it to add it to the date group hierarchy. And there it is. I could also take like the month, for example, and drag it up into the hierarchy. Usually you can, maybe you can't do that anymore. Or maybe my giant mouse is causing problems, but we'll add that in as well. So now I have my, and I could also add the date in as well. So I'm actually creating this hierarchy the same way that you're used to seeing it. So if I wanted to use a date hierarchy, let's come back in and let's collapse that up. And in the rows, let's close that out. Let's use the date hierarchy that we have here. So now that we're looking at this, and let me click somewhere else so I don't see that toolbar, I can zoom in and drill in, and now I'm seeing it all based off of quarters. So depending on what you're looking at, in this case, this last year, same period last year, what I'm looking at here, because this was looking at one individual period. Let's close that out. The last year one, that was looking at previous period. The other one was. This is the same period last year. So this is actually looking at the, should be looking at the quarter for the previous period. I see the year is working properly. Let's open up one period here. No, not a good one to open up. Also not a good one to open up. Oh, here we go. Yeah, okay, so February is correct. And Q2, that is not looking like it's adding up right. Oh, because it's adding it up for here, Q1. Okay, that's right, Q1 to Q1. In this particular case, the number is above. So I probably want to come in and make the total below. And that would probably make it a lot easier for me. Go to subtotals and put the number on the bottom. Then I could control it a little bit better. Okay, so now this is my Q2 one right here. So now I could see this indeed is matching up quarter for quarter. And it's also matching up month for month, depending on what I'm looking at. So that's kind of the cool thing about that. Through the use of this, we ended up getting a little mini DAX lesson, but that's another cool thing about using that calculate, because it's the context is because it's the controlling of the filters. So the fact that I overrode the filter, I said ignore Q2 for 2026 and give me the same period, Q2 for the previous period, 2025. And that gives me the ability to do that. And I could actually go back 2 years by just doing a -1 there with it as well. So I could get to the period from 2 periods ago. All right, enough of that. So that is this. So we're going to take all the different pieces that we had next month and put them together into some pretty cool visuals, and that should work. And with no more questions, then we'll wrap it up for today.